The following presentation, entitled Mixing Research Methods, an approach to letting the evolving research question drive a PBRN line of investigation, was given by Susan Flocky, Ph.D., and Kurt Stange, M.D., Ph.D., on October 16, 2008, as part of the 2008 PBRN seminar series at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio.
I want to welcome everyone to the Practice-Based Research Network seminar series. Thank you for coming back again for another session. Tonight's seminar will be given by two speakers from the Department of Family Medicine, Dr. Sue Flocky and Kurt Stange. And their topic will be qualitative methods and multi-method research design. And you've already met Kurt. He's done at least one other presentation, I believe. So I'm going to introduce now to you Dr. Sue Flocky. And Sue is Associate Professor in the Department of Family Medicine, Biostatistics, and Epidemiology here at Case. She has a Ph.D. in Health Services Research here from Case and has done significant work in health behavior change, research, and family practice. It's interesting that both speakers who are doing the presentation tonight and have a lot of experience in qualitative methods and multi-method research designs were originally trained in epidemiology and biostatistics. So they've seen some real positive benefit of getting involved in qualitative inquiry and developing methods to integrate these methods into quantitative sciences. So they've done some really innovative work in integrating qualitative and quantitative inquiry, which they'll tell you more about. So please welcome Dr. Sue Flocky.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, and very much looking forward to doing this talk and chatting with you about mixed methods. And thanks, Jim, for the introduction. As I like to describe it, I really am trained as a quantitative researcher, but the questions that I was posing tended to be more along the lines of qualitative questions. And it was really in trying to dip into addressing some of those questions that I got more and more involved in different kinds of methods and then mixing methods. So I have to give the disclaimer that I'm not really a card-carrying qualitative researcher. I'm interested in those methods. And I know there's probably others within the room who do have more of a tradition in qualitative methods. Does anybody, can folks say what kind of background they've had? How many folks have had some experience conducting qualitative research? Okay, how about mixed methods research? Where you had both? Okay, so there's some folks who can jump in on this discussion. Bottom left, yeah. Yeah, why don't you go ahead, because it doesn't look like it's paying attention to me. So let me just give you an overview of what we'd like to accomplish. So I'm going to talk about the first 4 points, and then we're going to have Kurt come up and join and talk about the multidisciplinary process. And we've kind of taken bits and pieces from each other's talks on these. So I'm going to ask Kurt to kind of jump in and add commentary as we're moving through this. But just as an overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about qualitative methods and contrast that with quantitative methods in just a simple table. I want to give a little bit more depth about, or at least raise your awareness of different traditions of qualitative methods, and then talk a little bit about decisions that drive your research study. And then talk specifically about mixed methods and different approaches to this. And then provide an example line of inquiry and some spin-off studies that exemplify some mixed methods research. So what we're looking at here is a contrast between quantitative analyses and qualitative analyses. And what are in each of these rows are just different key aspects of how you conduct research. And what's highlighted here are just a few elements, but the role of the researcher for quantitative analyses tends to be detached and objective as possible. Okay? Whereas in qualitative research, the researcher is the data collection tool. They are engaged. They continue to ask questions. The purpose of quantitative analyses tends to be focused on testing hypotheses, as opposed to qualitative studies where the focus or the purpose is more on describing or developing theory. Data collection methods, in particularly the stance on your sampling, is quite different. In quantitative methods, you describe your sampling scheme and you do it. You define things a priori, you know what you're going to measure and how you're going to measure them, and you do that all up front. It's very structured. Whereas with qualitative methods, the data collection approach, the sampling scheme, you have a starting point and you have a general approach, but you want that to evolve based on what it is that you're learning, with a goal of being very flexible, that it should be iterative, and that you want to continue sampling based on what it is that you're learning so that you really get down to the depth of understanding whatever phenomena that you're after. The data analysis with quantitative, it's deductive, based on statistics, whereas with qualitative, there's wide variation, but it is generally inductive and iterative. And again, leading to more data collection, it tends to be iterative and recursive. Types of data, quantitative, you're talking about numbers. Qualitative, you're predominantly talking about words. And the products are quite different. With quantitative, you generally end up with a status of your hypothesis. Was that hypothesis true or not? Whereas with the product of qualitative, I have text, which is quite generic, and we'll see some more examples on the next. But you may end up with theory. You may end up with a biography. You're going to end up with a rich description as opposed to a simple single answer. So next slide, please. This is what I wanted to point out for those of you who have maybe less experience with qualitative methods. I think we tend to really generalize qualitative methods as if they are all one sort of thing. I believe that there's far more diversity in qualitative methods than there is in quantitative methods. And what I mean by diversity is there's diversity in the philosophy, there's diversity in method, there's diversity in approach. So for example, ethnography, the purpose of this qualitative method is a cultural description. The methods involve intensive field work where you may spend a year or 2 or 3 investigating various aspects of the culture and using multiple methods, interview, observation, survey, and so forth. And the allied discipline would be anthropology. This is the discipline in which it's rooted. Phenomenology is another qualitative method where the purpose is to explore the lived experience. The purpose and the methods are quite different from ethnography. The analysis tends to focus very on carefully selected cases, and they tend to be very few, relatively speaking to epidemiology, where you really do a great deal of in-depth interview to formulate meaning, and this is rooted in psychology. Another kind of qualitative method to think about is biography. And some folks wouldn't think of that as a particular method, but it falls under qualitative methods where the purpose is discerning the meaning of experiences as recorded through history. Okay, so this gives you a feel for that there's quite a bit of diversity when it comes to qualitative methods. There's many traditions behind them, and there are likewise many methods. What I wanted to highlight in this slide is that in addition to your research question, what really drives your study, we tend to focus in on the study design and the specific methods. And it's typically behind the scenes of the epistemology, the theory of knowledge, and the theoretical or philosophical perspective, because we tend to work within circles of like-minded people. And we'll touch on that a little bit more when Kurt comes up and talks about multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary teams. These things don't become so apparent until you start mixing it up, that we're mostly thinking about these things in terms of driving the study. So I just want to give you a little foreshadowing on that. So when we're talking about mixed methods, we're talking about combining together quantitative and qualitative methods. And there's a variety of ways that you can do this. My first comment here is the general consensus is that it's no longer adequate to just have quantitative or just have qualitative, that really to understand different phenomena, both are necessary. But this is useful to think about when you're approaching mixed methods. It could be mixed within a study, and I think that that's what most folks think about. It's like, okay, well, this is predominantly a quantitative study, and I'm going to collect a little bit of qualitative or open-ended data to help understand some greater depth about something I don't quite understand well enough to select a measure or ask very, very specific questions. But other ways to think about mixed methods is mixing within a line of inquiry, and we'll show you some examples of that. So perhaps a quantitative study that's followed by a qualitative study. Another way of mixing methods would be mixing within something broader than a line of inquiry. So mixing within a discipline. So thinking about the whole area of health behavior change, health behavior advice, we really have a lot to learn from both quantitative and qualitative kinds of studies. That's what I mean by mixing within a broad area. So I really like this quote. Attack the research problem with an arsenal of methods that have non-overlapping weaknesses in addition to complementary strengths. So that ought to be the stance of you as you're conducting your research and doing practice-based research is, okay, I've got my research question. You know, what are all of the research methods that I can get at this, and which ones are going to be most informative, which are going to be the strongest, and then which ones are non-overlapping, because that's going to give you the best information. So there are a variety of approaches to mixing methods. One would be, as I had mentioned before, a sequential study where the first one is perhaps quantitative, you learn something, but you have some huge holes in your understanding of what's really going on. And it prompts wanting to know some more detail, wanting to explore more deeply. So that quantitative study could be followed by a more in-depth qualitative study. Alternatively, you may have started out with a qualitative study to understand the phenomena, to try to wrap your hands around a concept. What is cultural competency? How the heck do we measure that? What does that mean to people? And then you would potentially follow that up with a quantitative study once you've gained a toehold. Okay, those would be sequential studies. You can also conduct mixed methods within the same study. And in my experience, this has been, it takes the shape of one being in the foreground versus the other. Or a dominant and less dominant type. So I'll show you an example that was very much a quantitatively oriented study in which some qualitative data were collected, kind of to help flesh out some things, but it was predominantly a quantitative study. And then that one was actually followed by a predominantly qualitative study with a little bit of quantitative data collected in. But that's another approach. A third approach is to have both quantitative and qualitative data collected in a very complementary way. I think I'm doing that now with a current study that I have. I didn't think I was doing that because I thought that the quantitative was going to be much more prominent than the qualitative. But what's turning out right now with a study that I have where I've collected audio recordings of doctor-patient talk, and I thought I was going to be spending about a year learning aspects of that talk and trying to discern what a teachable moment is for health behavior change. And then to take a look at patient survey and patient report of outcomes. I thought that was going to be predominantly quantitative, and it has turned out to be significantly more work on the qualitative end than I had anticipated, to the point where right now it feels very balanced. I didn't want it to feel balanced, but that's where it is. So other aspects to approaching mixing methods. So what I was talking about before were really study design. And this is more about approaches to data. Data transformation is one strategy, and what that means is converting data of one type to another type. And typically this goes in the direction of having some qualitative findings, quantifying those, and then using those in a quantitative analysis. It can go in the direction of taking your quantitative data and examining that quantitative data in a way that generates qualitative understanding, qualitative data. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. There were quite a few factors about practice setting and practice structure and practice processes related to, or proposed to be related to, preventive service delivery. And there was a checklist that somebody had completed on these different practices. And these were quantitative data. Okay, we had these different ratings of cost practices. We had a hard time making sense of individual variables being associated with preventive service delivery, and thought that approach, kind of a univariate approach or a multivariable approach, seeing which of these, 16, 18 characteristics are most strongly associated with preventive service delivery, seemed very unsatisfactory because it wasn't capturing the whole of the practice. And we had a sense that there were groupings, different configurations of practices. So we used these quantitative data in an analysis called cluster analysis, which is a non-statistical analysis, to generate profiles, these groupings of characteristics, and then named these groupings, these configurations or profiles, so that we now had groups, kind of, that we had very rich description about according to their characteristics. So I think that would be one example that I've had of moving from quantitative to what I would call more of a qualitative variable of this group identity. The typology development is another approach, and that's kind of what I've just described. And then extreme case analyses. This is an approach that Kurt and his colleagues used for one of his analyses, one of his large studies, which I'll point out on a study map in just a few minutes. But in looking at some quantitative data, identified the real outliers. Who were these practices, these primary care practices that changed so dramatically? And how were they different than the practices that really didn't budge at all? But this idea of taking a look at those extremes is probably a good contrast between a typical quantitative analyst who would say, there are outliers, you need to throw them out of the sample, right? Versus a qualitatively oriented researcher that would say, no, those are probably the most interesting and informative cases that you can investigate. Those are the ones to look at carefully. So this is the example line of inquiry, and this is largely Kurt's line of inquiry, along with a couple of other colleagues. So I'm going to give a stab at this, but this is where Kurt's going to kind of jump in and tell the real story on it. So started off with the DOPC study, the Direct Observation of Primary Care study. And this project goes back to really about 1991 when it was conceived, and it was actually conducted in 94 and 95. And the original plan was to do an intervention to improve practice delivery of preventive service delivery. But based on the very early draft, realized that it really didn't know enough to conduct an intervention. And what we really needed was some basic information about what was going on within practice and how things were happening. What I want to point out is that on the left-hand side are observational studies, and on the right-hand side are intervention studies. So this very large observational study of the content and context of primary care prompted both, and this was largely quantitative, with a little bit of qualitative analyses, qualitative data collection added in, which turned out to be very informative. And we actually were able to collect better data than our qualitative-oriented consultants thought we would be able to. But this study prompted a very detailed qualitative study. And both of these informed the idea for the first intervention study. All of these studies included mixed methods. In this study, the quantitative were in the foregrounds. In this study, the qualitative data were in the foregrounds. And in this study, I would say it was almost balanced, but it was a randomized, practice-based, randomized group trial with quantitative outcomes. The qualitative analyses of this study were done in this one. Again, back to the observational. This is the study that examined the extreme outliers and was examining the processes and the qualitative data that were collected about those practices. You can kind of see how we've got this line of inquiry, and then even within a particular study, we tended to have mixed methods with some in the foreground, some in the background. But that in terms of a line of inquiry, the observational studies were informing intervention studies. And then the neat thing is that the intervention studies were being used to inform yet more observational studies. So I just want to point out, for the direct observation of primary care study, when I say we used multiple methods, I just want to walk you through. This was really a pretty remarkable study that collected an enormous amount of data in a very short time. But it was a cross-sectional observation study of 84 practices, 4,454 patient encounters, and 138 physicians. The really unique piece was that these patient encounters were observed by a research nurse. And this research nurse had a data collection form that included all 189 U.S. Preventive Services Task Force recommended services that they were to check off as they were happening, and to be able to record all of that, along with a bunch of other stuff that we thought would be really neat to know during the visit. They were also wearing this little headset that every 5 seconds it would say observe, and then 15 seconds later it would say record. Observe, record. And I fondly remember that because, that was to assess the Davis observation code, which gets at 20 behaviors, 20 primary care behaviors that physicians do every 20 seconds. So we have very, very detailed information about what physicians and patients were doing during that visit. They could mark off multiple behaviors within that code. They could be obtaining history while counseling them about quitting smoking. Multiple things could be going on. They could be asking them questions while they're doing a physical exam, so on. But I fondly remember that because at that point in time, my office was right next to the conference room where they had the reliability testing, where all the teams of nurses would come in, and we had a video that they would watch as a training video and reliability videos, and they would just crank up the set so everybody could hear it, and it would be going, observe, record, for hours while they were doing their reliability checks throughout the study. The positive side is that we achieved and maintained very high reliability for all of the measures. As annoying as that was, it was worth it. So there was direct observation, some pretty unique stuff. This Davis observation code had been used on videotapes of residents, but it had never been used live. So this was kind of a pretty cool innovation and the first to do it, and certainly the first to do it on a massive amount of patients. There was a medical record review, and on the medical record review, the exact same preventive service delivery services matched up so that we could compare what was on the direct observation checklist, what the nurses saw happened, and what got documented in the medical record. Okay, so it was a really cool methods opportunity to see what potential biases there were in recording preventive services within the medical record. Patient exit questionnaire. Guess what we put on the patient exit questionnaire? All of the preventive services. So we could see patient report compared to medical record compared to direct observation. Billing data were collected. There was a practice environment checklist. And here at the very bottom of the list, last but not least, are ethnographic field notes, where the nurse team that was out in the practice would write down their observations for their day, practice structure, what was going on within the practice, and they were following specific points within the environmental checklist. So that was one I wanted to share. The other one I wanted to share is the qualitative study that followed this. And the reason I want to kind of juxtapose these and show the methods that were collected and really demonstrate what I'm talking about with the quantitative in the foreground, qualitative in the background, and vice versa. So in this one, this was led by a colleague, Ben Crabtree, who's in Nebraska at the time. And it was an in-depth, multi-method comparative case study of 18 family practices. They collected data on a lot of visits, but they were there for a really long time. They hung out in these practices for 4 to 8 weeks. Okay, they were really there. Ben is trained as an anthropologist, so he was really taking this, learning the culture of a primary care practice to heart. So there was longer direct observation of these visits. The field notes, they didn't do a checklist really. They didn't audio record. The observers wrote very, very detailed, and sometimes up to a full page, field notes of what transpired in those visits. And some of those notes are really amazing. They're very, very detailed and very useful notes. But they got much more detailed data on how things happen within the practice than we did in our 2-day window of observation. They also collected some chart audits of patients, but they also did all the clinician interviews and staff. I should put this guy at the bottom because that really is their quantitative piece that they had included. I've said and touched on pretty much everything that I wanted to. Well, let me just point out a few things here. So we started off with a DOPC study. These are a couple of spin-off studies, and I just show you how corrupted I became being trained as a quantitative researcher. My dissertation data actually came from the DOPC study, and it was quantitative. It was a measure of primary care looking at quantitative outcomes. And what we learned from this data set is that physicians do a pretty good job with screening. They do a pretty good job with immunizations. Don't do such a good job with health behavior change. And that really captured my attention. I thought that the relationship was part of it, but I was really, really curious about what the heck was going on with health behavior change. So that led to one of the first projects that I took the lead on, which I called the Exemplar Study, which is where I went and collected audio recordings from 5 physicians and 186 patients to really listen in to what the content of this advice is and how is it happening, and how is it that in this study we can show that, yep, the doctor talked about it, but only half the patients are recalling it right after the visit. You just had your visit, 10 minutes later, the recall's not so good. How can that be? So this study led directly to the one I'm currently wrapping up, but it also helped inform a couple of intervention studies in really trying to recognize brief advice and what kinds of assistance physicians really could use. And these 2 studies were more focused on very focused physician advice, but then utilizing community resources for change, recognizing that within that brief office visit, you don't have enough time to do it all, and that most physicians really weren't aware of resources that were available in the community. So how can we connect them up? Can we work together to create some tools to help launch that? So I've been kind of affected by the observational and intervention study and the connection between. So that's where I'm going to stop. Are there any questions right now or comments, or will I get Kurt mic'd up?
I'm just sort of curious. You mentioned that in some of the observation of data, the outliers would be something of interest. And it would, I'm sort of struggling with, what do you actually do? It seems that almost by definition, it's such a few number of points. There's no trend per se. I mean, have you looked at the outliers? I mean, what's been your experience with, what does that lead to, I guess? I'm just curious.
Well, it led to a model.
So the question is what can you really do with these outliers? There's so few numbers. And one of the strengths of a multi-method approach is that you can nest your understanding of those outliers within an understanding of how they fit with the whole group that you're studying, so you know how they relate to everybody else. The example that Sue used from this line of inquiry was when we had this clinical trial called Step Up. We did this intervention to try to improve preventive service delivery in practice. And statistically, on average, there was a fairly dramatic improvement in the rate at which doctors delivered preventive services to patients. But if you do a histogram of the rate of improvement, there's a large amount of variability from that. There were a couple of practices that made no change, and there were most practices went up about almost double the rate of health behavior counseling. But there were some practices that were 3 times. One practice quadrupled their rate. Well, it was very career-making for me to have this nice statistically significant effect overall, but that really covers up a lot of meaning. What is going on in those practices that made huge changes? And if you're thinking about what the next step is for improving practice, you'd really like to know what went on with them, and you'd like to contrast it with what happened in the others. So that was a quantitative study on the classic experimental design, a clinical trial. But then we nested a qualitative study within that, and we started using a quantitative sampling frame, sampling from the extremes. So we took the practice that quadrupled their rate and said, what happened there? Took the 2 practices that made no change, what happened there, and just started sampling in until we reached saturation, until we said, well, we're not really learning anything new. And then we said, well, here are some of the characteristics of some of the practices that made the big change. And then we actually sampled a few more practices on those characteristics just to flesh that out. And we tried to sample a couple other practices that seemed to contrast with that, just until we got a sense that we really knew what was going on. And as Sue mentioned, we did get a theoretical model from that. We identified factors that seemed to be associated with practices making big change. And it seemed to be related to the motivation of the people within the practice and external motivators outside the practice. So it wasn't just about what people wanted to do in the practice, it was what was happening in the healthcare system and the community around them that affected that motivation. And then it was the practice's capacity to change. And we've done a lot of research since then looking at trying to tease that out. What do we mean by capacity to change? And then how they saw their options, their possibility for change. And then we mapped out the interactions between all of those. And we found that model to be very useful in doing tailored interventions. It gives us a way of thinking about what things you pay attention to and trying to understand the process of change and trying to improve the process of change. And the The quantitative study doesn't tell you any of that. We just know that on average what we did worked. But how it worked and how it worked differently in different sites and how trying to work as an individual practice to change or as a facilitator or a healthcare system trying to improve practices, it doesn't really tell you how to do that. And there are, while some of the things we found out quantitatively worked, we found some things that could predict change, that if we knew certain things about a practice at baseline, we could statistically predict who changed. But that's kind of pretty proscriptive, and we found some just astounding exceptions to those rules that are worth knowing about. Because if you don't know about those exceptions, you write off people. So we found one practice that was just the model for a practice that wasn't going to change at baseline. It turns out that was the practice that had the second biggest change. Well, what happened to that? Well, we did this in-depth case study and found that their motivation changed over the course of the study. They actually weren't motivated particularly to improve preventive service delivery, but their office manager for 20 years got a brain tumor, and the lead physician's wife came in and took over as the practice manager and intercepted an email from our facilitator, and she said, "Hey Archie," and I'll use the name because they became co-authors on this case report that we did from this in a participatory research way. She said, "Archie, look, we're having to redo everything in the practice because Mary's not going to be with us much longer. The folks that these step up folks are trying to do to improve preventive service delivery, isn't that a model for how we need to have a more system-oriented approach to practice? If we develop the systems that they're trying to have us do to improve preventive service delivery, wouldn't that help us with the other systems we need to get in place for billing and for answering our phone calls?" And he said, "Oh yeah." So then they became highly motivated. They worked on all these things to improve their preventive service delivery and really embedded those systems in their practice because that was a model for how they were going to do other changes. So that's part of the model that we developed for this, that just like a clinician taking care of a patient maybe predicts whether this person's at a stage of readiness to change, and if the answer is no, well, you kind of write them off. You don't put a lot of energy there, but you stick with them. And this kind of is what Sue did with her teachable moment study. And you stick with the patient, and then you watch for when there's the teachable moment. Something's changed. Now they're ready. And so, because we could nest that understanding within the quantitative of who made big changes and little, the combination is just way more powerful than a small qualitative study of a few people, and you don't really know how they relate to anything else, or just the quantitative where you know what happened on average. And so that's why Jim mentioned in the introduction, both Sue and I's degrees are in the quantitative sciences, but we really have learned a lot on the street, a lot from colleagues. And really, most of our research is mixed methods now. A lot of it actually is heavily qualitative. And these approaches are complementary, and they're particularly relevant for practice-based network research, because so many of the phenomena that we're studying in practice are context-dependent. And our quantitative methods are good for isolating phenomena from the context so we can study them. And that's beneficial for a lot of the things that we want to study in ways that are generalizable and potentially transportable. But to really understand what's going on, you need to recontextualize them. And so methods that allow you within a study or within a line of inquiry to go back and forth are just helpful in really advancing understanding. And even if I just think about just what it's like to be an investigator, a clinical trial, you have a hypothesis, you spend a year or two getting funded, you spend 5 years collecting the data, and at the end you get, as Sue pointed out, a yes-no answer to what you thought now 6 or 7 years ago. And frankly, life is too short to just do that. You want to learn something along the way there. So even within a classic experimental design, putting some qualitative methods in is helpful. And one of the weaknesses of qualitative methods often is that people don't pay enough. This is stereotyping, and I'm sorry for that, but often qualitative researchers don't pay enough attention to what Colin mentioned, which is the sampling. How do the small number that you're studying relate to other things? Well, that's where some quantitative methods, even in a primarily qualitative study, can really help you know how these things that you're studying in depth relate to something else. Another reason that these mixed methods are helpful for practice-based network research is that in some way they parallel the clinical process. So if you look at the knowledge that we have as clinicians, largely that comes from statistical studies. But what we do in practice is we actually take that statistical knowledge, what works on average in a clinical trial of 1,000 diabetics, and try to apply this to this one diabetic patient in front of us. So we're taking the numbers and trying to put it in the context of the narratives. So when you're working with practice-based networks, when you're working with clinicians, there's something intuitive about both of these methods. The clinical method is often quite qualitative, but the training that clinicians have is quite quantitative. We're trained to think about things quantitatively. And so it gets at both the heart at the head, it gets at the numbers and the narratives, and really what we do clinically is often iterating back and forth between those stories of individual people and what we know from studies that try to isolate the phenomena in ways that get rid of some of the biases that you can have if that's all you have are the individual stories. Well,
is mixed methods unique to primary care, or are we seeing a trend toward mixed method usage in other specialties as well?
so the question is mixed method research unique to primary care? No. I mean, as Sue mentioned, there are these long traditions of research methods that are both qualitative and quantitative. In the social sciences, this mixing has been happening for a long time. I think it's happening more in healthcare research in general lately, but the qualitative methods are in general less mainstream in biomedical research. I sit on some national panels that choose people for career development awards, and it is more common in primary care research, I think, than in other healthcare disciplines. But in both fields, you see a lot of people, particularly at the career development stage, using mixed methods. And I think that's a particularly good idea because the quantitative methods, I mean, you can often crank out quantitative studies quickly if you have existing data, and you can get your publication record going. But frankly, you often don't generate the richness of ideas that you generate in the qualitative. And so it's very, very common in career development awards to see people using mixed methods, often sequentially, as Sue pointed out, but sometimes together. And it's often the qualitative that you really get the richness of ideas that you then spend many years studying quantitatively or develop quantitative measures from. But as Sue also pointed out with that diagram, it's helpful often to go back and forth between the methods. So I think that the mixing of methods is more common in biomedical research in the primary care, but it's certainly not unique to that. And certainly in nursing, there's a long tradition of qualitative research and mixed methods research as well. Sue had me come up at this stage in the talk, which is really about looking at collaboration, and it's a slightly peripheral topic, but actually related, because often mixed methods research ends up being multidisciplinary research or cross-disciplinary research. And that's often because people are trained in only one discipline. And Sue pointed out that behind that there are kind of worldviews and things as well. So often when you're doing mixed methods research, you will do that in a team. And frankly, even research now that's not mixed methods is done in teams as well. So that the previous slide had the typology of collaboration that goes from multidisciplinary to interdisciplinary to transdisciplinary. So multidisciplinary research involves multiple disciplines, but each is working in a little bit of a silo, contributing their piece to solving a problem. It's a little bit like an edited textbook, where really the editor of the textbook thinks, what do we need to have a picture of this field, gets everybody writing their own chapter in the area, and it's really up to you as a reader to start to put that together. And there's a progression in teams that often goes from this multidisciplinary to interdisciplinary, which is where conversation starts happening between the disciplines, where you're working together, working on a solving problem. So whereas the multidisciplinary really is more like an edited book, everybody contributes their own chapter, this you're actually working as a collaborative team, still talking your own disciplinary language, still being in your expert mode on your part of the puzzle. The metaphor for this, rather than an edited book, is more like a collaborative healthcare team. And a lot of cancer centers, for example, work like this. You'll have a complicated patient with a cancer, and you'll have the pathologist there when the interdisciplinary team meets, showing the pathology slides, and the surgeon saying what she found on the operation, and the radiation oncologist saying this is what we could offer, the oncologist saying this is what the chemotherapy would be, talking about how you stage that, the nurse talking about the nursing care that's needed along with that, the social worker trying to bring in the family and the social dimension and the payment dimensions. They're working together. They're united by working on this patient, this common patient. They're talking with each other, but they kind of go up to their disciplinary lines and stop and try to put that all together to integrate the care of the individual patient. And then at transdisciplinary research, you can recognize this by the second bullet point here, that you start creating a new shared language. So people aren't just using their own disciplinary jargon. You're starting to create some new terms from some shared experience you have from working together as a team. There's a progression here, and going further along this progression requires more work, and it's frankly not always worth it. But the line of inquiry that Sue showed, I've been working on for 17 or 18 years, and it's one of the joys of my professional life is having moved up this typology to the transdisciplinary, where Sue mentioned Ben Crabtree, who's an anthropologist. In that original study, we had a health economist, we had several nurses, we had a psychologist, we had an epidemiologist, we had several physicians, and we started to develop a common language. We could see there was something more that we had by working together than we had separately, and it was worth it to us to invest the time in developing these relationships, developing the common language. And this team's now been together for 17 or 18 years, and sometimes you get a little stale. You get this common. You have to worry that you get this common language, and that's very nice. You've got your own little club, but you can't talk to the outside world. So sometimes in this process, you go up and down. Sometimes we actually then will purposely go down from transdisciplinary to interdisciplinary by inviting someone else who has a different viewpoint, different knowledge, shake us up, force us to not use our common jargon that we've developed to get together, but go back to the basic things and try to find common ground again. One example of where I tried to move along this typology and it didn't work, I was involved in a study of health service use among older people in Cleveland, and it was run by a very senior geriatrician and a very senior sociologist. And they wanted someone new to come in. And I said, well, if you want me to come in, I think you should also have an anthropologist to come in, because we're studying how old people use health services in the community. We'll know what happens statistically, but boy, a few stories about what happens would be really useful. And so we did have an anthropologist who came and joined the team, brought a couple of graduate students, and they did some statistical sampling to try to represent what the numbers were telling us, and then they did some propulsive sampling based on the stories they were hearing to follow up on some of their leads. And I was trying to do this translation to help this common language, and it frankly didn't work. The anthropologist would tell his stories, and the geriatrician and the sociologist, who are both very quantitatively trained, would just listen and say, uh-huh. And then they would show their models, their statistical models, what we learned from there, and the anthropologists and the grad students would say, uh-huh. And so I'd say, so what you're saying is this, and what you're saying is this, and if we put these together, I did that for 3.5 years and never was able to break down the boundaries. I think that's an example of one where if we could have done it, we would have gotten higher level insight. So it doesn't always work. And there's sometimes where it's frankly not worth it to do that. The questions or the time that you have isn't worth it. This next slide, that's titled 6 Stages of Collaboration, is designed to give you a sense of where you are in the process. And I've paired these bullet points to roughly represent the stage of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary for the third and fourth ones, and then transdisciplinary. So at these first stages, if you want the group to work at all, you really need to have a little bit of acceptance. Okay, we're all different, and I've never really liked your discipline, but okay, I can see that there's some value to that, and maybe occasionally validating that worth. And your group process is about trying to develop some shared expectations for what you're contributing to this edited book. And that's really what we had in this team that I just mentioned, where I never went beyond this. It was, our shared expectations was that, okay, the anthropologist was going to do some good stories and publish them in the Anthropology Journal, and the quantitative people were going to publish things in the sociology and geriatrics and gerontology journals, and there was no crosstalk. Sue?
Did you guys in that group, did you ever co-publish anything?
No. It was a total failure in that regard. On the other hand,
Did any papers come out of that?
yes. So we have 5 or 6 papers in the anthropology journals, and then a similar amount in the other journals. And I could analyze that a lot, but I won't. So then the moving on to interdisciplinary, this is my friend and colleague Will Miller's term, declaring group process. I kind of like that. I kind of like that term. You say, okay, we're actually going to work together as a group, and you start to get a sense of commitment toward that, and you start getting some consensus on what it is that you're actually working on. And then when you're moving on to transdisciplinary, you're really developing this common space. You're saying, I have to work hard coming to this group, but I just get a sense I'm learning something more. I have a chance to contribute something more than I have. What I'm learning here when I go back and work within my own disciplinary field helps me be a more novel contributor in that field. So you're just sensing there's something more here, sensing this common space, and when it works, it leads to this sustained action of working together as a team, often reconstituting when you need to be stimulated by other people. As you're following a line of inquiry, as Sue talked about, that's another advantage of these mixed methods, is you don't get stuck with saying, well, I do kind of secondary data analyses on large data sets, and so when you do that, when you define yourself that way, there's only a certain set of questions that you answer, and you start getting something interesting, but you can't go to the next step because your methods don't allow you to do it. So some of the benefits are really this working across disciplines does facilitate creativity and learning, lets you match the question, lets you pursue multiple lines of inquiry. So with these mixed methods and with these teams, one way of being productive being productive in a scholarly fashion is that different people can take the lead on different parts that they're expert in. And actually, one of that team I mentioned that wasn't functional, the PI and the co-PI were very tight with the data. And if you have more of a sense of abundance with the data, let people write papers or do analyses with their own perspective, things that are going to talk to their own field, you really increase the impact of what's coming out of your work. The data-informed future studies. One of the things I love about doing qualitative methods is that's where I get the ideas for what the next quantitative thing is or the next quantitative thing. And occasionally the quantitative things will stimulate things that I want to look at more. Like from the DOPC study that Sue mentioned, one regret I have is not doing a qualitative study that follows up a quantitative analysis where we looked at physicians in the network who were very high volume. Some of them were seeing 60 patients a day versus the low volume ones seeing a small number of patients a day. And we looked at how they spent their time and found it was very similar, but just smaller, obviously shorter visits, and looked at their rates of preventive service delivery and patient satisfaction and whatnot. And there were some differences, but the differences were actually surprisingly small. I always regret not going and doing a qualitative study of those high volume physicians. I just wanted to know how do they even see 60 patients a day? I just want to mention the bottom point of the benefits. This is actually fun. This is what makes it fun. It's working across the disciplinary boundaries, getting the different ideas, having someone who has a different interpretation, having a story to go with the numbers. It's cool. The pitfalls, if you want to move up this ladder, it takes time and it's not always worth it. And I think that's fine. I don't work in a transdisciplinary process in all the groups I'm in. The design and analysis are continually being reinvented, and so when you're writing grant applications with these iterative designs, it's harder than a standard design where you can just say, we're doing a cohort study, we're doing a clinical trial. You say a phrase and everybody kind of knows what you mean versus this iterative design where you're starting off with a quantitative collection and doing some qualitative sampling on the basis of that. I just showed Colin a diagram we have for a grant application that's going in that has all these circles and multiple feedback loops in it, and I just hope the reviewers get it. But the onus is on you then to explain that in a way that shows that you're doing this in a rigorous way. And often what you end up doing is just telling them what you're going to do and why you're doing it, just going through the sequence of your iterative design and justifying that. Obviously, that requires being flexible, and I think we're training more people to be multi-methodologists now. I mean, one of the reasons that I had to have a team is that I didn't have skills in this to begin with. There are more and more people that are coming out of their training now with skills in both these methods. And I think you still probably want a team working with you, but that makes you a better team leader if you really can talk both languages to begin with. So this is the last slide. The advantage of this transdisciplinary and multi-method approach is it allows you to tailor the methods to the question. It helps you develop relationships that are helpful in pursuing a line of inquiry. And it's well suited for PBRN studies because it's similar to the clinical method where you use both quantitative and qualitative data. And it's useful for many of the questions that networks want to ask, which are often involve counting things and often involve statistical analyses, but where you'd like to be able to say something about how that relates to the context of the individual patient or the individual practice setting or even the network setting. And so it lets you have both of those. So you can put the last slide, which has here's a few references in addition to the ones that you have in the handout, and then the last slide has our email addresses. So I'm happy to have Sue come back up and have any discussion or questions or comments that people have.
Something you said earlier kind of resonated with me, and it's probably stating it obvious, but you said that the qualitative approach is context-based. And I think about our field and how, people are context-based and illness is context-based, so why wouldn't we use methods that are context-based? And the reason I ask about other fields joining in this approach to studying anything, but specifically in the biomedical sciences is, number one, if a lot of people aren't doing it and we're relegated to only being able to publish in certain journal types or we're only going to reach certain audiences, that's disappointing. So I'd like to see it grow to other areas so it becomes a more, more recognized. Maybe it's more recognized than I understand, but I'd like to see that happen. And then also because it just makes better sense to get the answers that we're looking for. Because quantitative by itself just seems totally inadequate. When we take the whole context out of it, you're missing a lot of the picture.
Yep. Yes.
If I could just make a comment, what you're saying about the context. I have this unique situation where I've gone from working and teaching undergraduates to first-year graduate students. And to your point, I wonder if people do what they're used to doing or comfortable doing. So, maybe the quantitative has crossed their mind, but, like in engineering, we don't train them to consider the context. We train them to do X. And so the real challenge has been that the graduate students need to consider the context. And it's taken 8 weeks, in the class to get the students to really start asking questions and looking at things from a different perspective. So to your point, that the context is obvious, I'm just wondering if we're not, at an undergraduate level, training them not to consider the context and therefore predisposing the research, the graduate level, to head in that direction. I don't know.
Well, it's true. So the reason we have methods that isolate phenomena from context is that there are lots of biases in looking at the context, and so we have a hierarchy of evidence that tends to worship the clinical trial because we're really often trying to study interventions where that really often is the best method. And you want to be, if you're comparing two interventions, you'd like to be able to say, is it the intervention that's the reason for the different outcomes? And so there are valid reasons for those methods, and qualitative methods have ways built in to work on those biases, and that's kind of beyond the topic of what we're doing today. But it involves often reflexivity on the part of the investigator, because you often are the research instrument, just saying, well, what are my biases, and what am I going to do to get around that? And often that involves having multiple sources of data, having multiple people involved in interpreting the data, having sampling methods where you're particularly trying to challenge what you're finding. Okay, I've sampled these 3 practices that made huge changes. Well, let's sample some at the bottom, because maybe I'm attributing these huge changes these 3 practices made to this one factor. It turns out it's present in 2 of the 3 bottom ones as well. Well, it must be something else. So there are ways of building in that kind of rigor into qualitative methods as well. But it's harder to just say that in a couple of sentences. I mean, if you say we did a randomized clinical trial with good statistical power, the randomization worked, we had blinded evaluators, we had blinded allocation. I mean, you can say a few things that everybody says that's done well. The other studies, you really have to read through and see what they did.
In fact, it would almost seem that the qualitative would require more discipline, so that you don't inadvertently propagate opinion versus something that's more, sort of data-driven or validated statements versus opinion.
Right.
I think you can slip into opinion pretty easily.
Yep.
And so it actually might require, when you say double-blind and all these other things, it implies a certain technique which is very well known, and it conjures an image right away.
Right.
So ironically, the text, to your point, requires more discipline to get it right, I would think.
Right, and probably as an investigator, you are engaged in doing most of those activities, whereas on randomized trial, you can be totally away. You're not collecting the data, you're not doing the analysis, you're just interpreting, did it work? And you're hands off, clean, it's totally separate from the process, separate from understanding it, really.
What do you do when you have results that don't match? So if you're doing a qualitative intervention and you ask people, the patients, how do you think this worked? And they say, I loved it, I would recommend this to anybody, I think this has really helped me do diabetes self-management, I just really love this program. You get across the board, recommendation, and then you look at your outcome variable and you find no change. What do you do?
A not uncommon scenario, by the way. You look hard. I mean, that's one of the reasons you do it. That's where the next study comes from. There's something going on there that challenges something there. It challenges the measure of success. If the person says this was just a great thing and your measure of success doesn't match that, you need to go back and look at the measures, or maybe it's affecting something that affects their well-being but doesn't affect something that we know from some other data is actually affects their long-term outcomes. Maybe they're having a short-term euphoric effect in the intervention, but there's long-term detrimental things. But those are what you want to sample on and really drill down on, and that's what it's interesting. And like statistically, an outlier is a bad thing. That's a problem. And that problem comes up all the time in mixed methods research. And if you don't like that kind of problem, you probably shouldn't be doing mixed methods research. But that's where it gets fun, is you say, wow, so there's something going on here I didn't anticipate, and you drill down on it. Carl?
Just talk and make me reflect just on, you can take a statistical procedure like a factor analysis and come up with a construction that is getting into a qualitative kind of procedure, and it's like people, I don't know, do you kind of get what I mean? Like, I'm thinking of a study in which they were looking at depressed mood in widows, and they measured this in measured features expression in different ways and did factor analysis and kind of came up with this categorization of bereavement-associated depression, normal grief, and atypical grief. And so it's kind of interesting how you can take a quantitative procedure and then you are using conceptual frameworks that kind of are qualitative to come up with kind of this summative interpretation. Do you?
Sure, and so that often that work has been done in the hypothesis stage, and then you've kind of predetermined how you're going to interpret an answer in either direction. But if you look at a lot of quantitative papers, you look at the discussion section, it's just speculating at what it means, and really the authors are telling you what their worldview is often more than anything else, which is where it's nice to have a mixed methods approach so you can at least have some data and say, well, what did it mean from the perspective of the participants?
I think both methods, all methods, you're trying to identify patterns. And it really boils down to that. You're looking at variation and you're trying to understand patterns and the connection between things.
Thanks. Oops.
When grant proposals, these methods integrated the way that you guys have been integrating them lately, these are complex designs, and I wonder, are study sections well equipped to review these types of proposals?
You're really hitting us.
I hope so.
You're really hitting both of us sleep-deprived grant application writers in our soft underbelly right now.
Mine is a quantitative randomized trial. So I'm okay.
Oh, well, I'm vulnerable. I mean, it is more challenging to write up the qualitative portion of these. I have Ben Crabtree, who's one of the members of that team, coming to town this weekend, and I just went out and got his favorite beer, and he just finished his grant application. I just got a hot pad, and I just went out to a drugstore, spent $20 on a cold pack, because it's that beer, the hot pack, the cold pack that it required to get him to sit down at a computer, since he just finished his own grant application, and he's telling me he still has this horrible pain right here. I told him I'd give him a massage. She's out of town this weekend. I think he's not going. I think he's not going to take me up on it. I think it's a fairly safe offer. But if he wants it, I'll do it. But I got distracted there. That wasn't the point. But I've learned a lot from Ben, and what I've learned from him is to write these things up in ways that doesn't depend on knowing the disciplinary jargon. I mean, if you're writing these up for people that are all in the same field and you can use the jargon, they all know it, there's deep meaning behind every term, it's fine. But these study sections are multidisciplinary, I would say, occasionally interdisciplinary. And you have to write it so that everybody kind of gets what it is. And if it's an iterative design, just telling us a sequence often happens. So I've got a diagram that has a loop, because it's iterative, has multiple feedback loops in it. I've got each loop in each box numbered and lettered, and then I tell people why we're doing everything. But then when I write that up, when Ben and I write that up this weekend, it's going to be just a sequence. Here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. And even a person who's not schooled in that particular field will look at it and say, okay, well, I've never seen it done like that, but that kind of makes sense. And that's how you want to write it. And it's harder than just when you can just use jargon, be it quantitative or qualitative jargon, and people know about that. But people kind of like that, and if you look at B.F. Crabtree, if you look at almost any of his papers, that's how he does his methods in the papers too. He just kind of tells you what he did and why he did it, and you say, okay, well, I kind of believe, I'm going to have some confidence in the results that they come up with that. There were lots of checks and balances. It wasn't just Ben coming out at the end with what he thought to begin with. And I've seen that. I mean, you're really changed. You have these surprises, and you come up with things that are vastly different from what you thought to begin with. And that's what makes it interesting.
I would add to that one, too, if you are using multiple methods, I found it's helpful to create either a table or a diagram. If you have step one, what is the product of that step? and how does it relate to the next step. And oftentimes I will label this step generates the quantitative outcomes for this aim. These will then be used to do the sampling for the qualitative piece, which addresses this aim. I've also found, so mapping it out that way seems to help. I've also found it's very helpful to describe in the methods how rigor is evaluated. So how you would be that, so we're going to do it this way. We're doing this way because this is the standard and this is what's considered the best quality of rigor with this kind of data collection or this kind of data analysis. So give them the benchmark and then show them how you're measuring up to that benchmark or where you're falling short if you are.
If you think about it, though, it is probably a higher risk strategy because if they're doing a good review, they have to either have to get a mixed methodologist to review it, or they have to get a quantitative person, a qualitative person, different worldviews, more likely to be arguments, and the kiss of death is a split committee where one person gives it a 1 and one person gives it a 3, and you end up with a 2 as a priority score, which isn't going to get you over the funding line. So it probably is a riskier thing, and I have stories I can tell you about that, but I won't.
Are they forgiving, though, when there's enough of the quantitative that they're comfortable, and even if they're not so comfortable with the qualitative aspects of it, they think that it's a gimme, like they'll kind of advance you a little bit because you've got the quantitative piece in there?
I've done that. I've done a study that I'm sure got funded because of the quantitative and the qualitative. They said, well, it doesn't cost much more money because I hid the cost in the budget, and it looks like it might be some good. So that is one strategy. The other is to just put it out there why you're doing it, and if you really believe in it, if it's really important, is to say what you're doing and why you're doing it. And the thing is, if you're doing that, you're more likely to get points for innovation than you are. Oh yeah, this is the standard design. Oh, this is not the standard design. Oh, but I can see why this design is what's needed for the question and how it's going to give the answer. Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, Sue and Kerr, for that great presentation. I think you guys can see that these folks don't just use these methods, they actually develop these methods and have really pioneered their use and have published really widely on their use. So next week we have Dr. Mahbooba Mosavel of Case Metro Health, who will be coming and speaking on community-based participatory research. And that's a really interesting area and interesting methods that are used to involve community members, patients, in every aspect of the research process. She's a terrific speaker, so hope you'll come back for her. So, okay, thanks very much.